Proof of concepts are one of the most common requests we get from prospective clients wanting to try out the quantitative supply chain for themselves. However, unfortunately, this is something we frequently decline. First, because it can actually hurt the client's company, and second, because it can impact upon Lokad as well. Today, we're going to understand exactly why POCs don't work, and also understand what are the alternatives that are open to a customer in order to choose between the multitude of supply chain software out there. So Johannes, POCs have been around for absolute decades now, so they can't all be bad. So what are the industries where they actually work in?
So proof of concepts works well when you have a closed, narrow problem that you want to address. When basically you don't have to think of massive open possibilities where, so for example, the archetype of an area where a POC would work well would be, let's say, for example, to choose your email client, because you've used an email client, let's say Microsoft Outlook or Gmail for years. So you know what you should expect, you know your pain points. This is a fairly standardized, problem with standardized solution, and so you will be comparing. You will make a very precise comparison because you know exactly what to look for, etc., etc. And for your company, this is fundamentally something that is not transformative. It was transformative, decades ago when people started to use email altogether, but at this point, it's just to move from one email client to another. So here, this is typically sort of points where proof of concept will work well, and they will work well for all those super tactical, well-defined problems. The big challenge is that quantitative supply chain is kind of the opposite. It's something that will fundamentally transform your company, and it's fundamentally something that is completely non-local. So you can't execute a supply chain, locally from your desk. It's because there is like a world network that span over many locations, potentially many countries, that things get really complicated.
So this is something we'd probably think of more as kind of an open problem. So what is it that characterizes that as an open problem?
So quantitative supply chain is first an idea that we want to optimize, and in order to optimize, you need to measure. And just the very fact that you want to measure things in euros or dollars, it takes a considerable amount of effort to obtain a measurement that actually makes sense. And the measurement, the metric, is not the starting point, is actually a journey to refine the way your numerical recipe and how you even assess whether you are doing something good or bad for your company. I mean, obviously, serving customers is good, having enormous amount of stockouts is bad, yes. But then the question becomes exactly how do you assess the precise cost of every single stockout, the precise impact on customer loyalty for every single customer, etc., etc.
So when you say proof of concepts fundamentally don't work, is it just for the quantitative supply chain that they don't work, or is it for the supply chain industry as a whole?
I mean, most of the supply chain problems are very hard to frame as proof of concepts. By definition, supply chains involve like multiple parties. You have many suppliers, many clients, storage warehouses, production plants, etc. It's a very distributed challenge in essence, as the opposite of something that would be extremely local, such as doing the optimization of a manufacturing process that is completely transient, where you're just looking at this thing in complete isolation of the rest of the world. Kind of by definition, supply chains are completely connected to what was before you, all your suppliers, and what will happen after you, all your clients. So pretty much by definition, it's hard to find anything that is both local and meaningful. Because again, the problem in supply chains is that it's very easy to perform a local optimization. The problem is that when you do that, usually what you end up with is just moving problems around. So yes, you've done a great amount of effort for this product at this location, but guess what? You just created a problem for your supplier and maybe for a couple of clients as well by doing that. So you haven't solved the big picture. You've just kind of micro-optimized something locally. So that's make it, I would say, that makes kind of supply chain very challenging for proof of concepts in general. And then there is, I would say, another layer of difficulty in case of Lokad is that because we want to tackle the future and the uncertainties, there is the lead times that have to be taken into account. So whenever we are dealing with an industry where lead times are, let's say, you have to plan and execute things thinking like 3 months ahead. It means that no matter how you optimize, the numerical recipes that you have to optimize your supply chain, it means that one iteration takes pretty much as long as your lead time to come to pass. So that means that you can't really do anything in a time frame that is shorter than your lead time, and more realistically, you will need like 2 or 3 iterations. So again, if you had lead times that were like 3 months long, and we are talking of 2 or 3 iterations, we are talking what, 6 months, 9 months, suddenly it's not abusively long for enterprise software, but we start to get very far from what people think of when they think like a quick proof of concept.
Okay, so let's kind of unpick that a little bit. So what you're saying is that from a proof of concept, it's basically only looking at a small picture, and in order for a solution to really work and to prove itself, it needs to be looking at the whole bigger picture. And then the second thing you sort of mentioned there was to sort of do with lead times, and you're saying that a proof of concept is normally quite short, so we're not taking into account full lead times in order to really get the results and really understand what's happening. So how long should you really persevere and with a proof of concept before you're actually going to see any results?
So that's the point, is that if you wait until you finalize your measurements and it's absolutely clear that and that you can measure the benefits and quantify etc., it's going to take, the short answer is too long. So that's why typically what we suggest is to have in your very methodology a process that is highly capitalistic at every step. And it's driven by the vision. So what do I mean by capitalistic at every step? It's capitalistic first because, well, no matter how you want to optimize your supply chain, you will need this data to execute this optimization. So yes, the process is going to take a bit of time, but anyway, it is kind of independent from whichever vendor or even solution you pick. Even if you want to do it internally or with an external company, you will need to do this process. So that's that. So if you can execute your initiative in a way that you focus on what will not change with respect of whatever vendor is chosen, if any, at the end of the initiative, then you can be highly capitalistic, because there are a lot of things that are, I would say, low risk. For example, it's a bit an act of faith, but I would say you can believe me that you cannot optimize what you do not measure. So this is more like an act of faith in that respect. So well, you should start gathering the data for measurements. This very effort is probably going to go beyond what you think as eligible for a POC-sized effort.
That's probably quite surprising to a lot of our sort of viewers, because in terms of a proof of concept, the gathering the data should be the easy bit. That should be the thing that's supplied when you start the proof of concept. So why is it so difficult?
It's always difficult because reality has its own ways to make sure that your proof of concept attempts fail in the most miserable ways. So no, but more seriously, let's pick a real situation of what is happening. Let's say you have like a retail network that involves a couple of warehouses, a couple of production units, and maybe a couple of distribution locations. Now you start your initiative where you say, I want to optimize network, for the usual reasons. I want less stock outs, clients that are more happy with the way I serve them, etc., etc. Okay, good. Now you realize that you want to start your proof of concept, and you realize that getting the data, all the transactional data, is suddenly more difficult than it seemed at first. Why? because actually, for example, you could say, oh, we have the clients, the client orders should be easy. Well, yes and no, because you can have a lot of odd stuff, such as, for example, a client send you an order. You cannot fulfill this order because you have a stock out. So, okay, you diligently in the system record that the order could not have been fulfilled. And then the next day, the client repass another order that is even bigger. And why is it an even bigger order passed the next day? Well, the answer is that because you didn't fulfill the order of the client from the previous day. But where it becomes bizarre is that if you had fulfilled the first order, then there probably would never have been a second order the next day. So suddenly you say, okay, I want to reflect historical demand, not just the raw historical stream of orders from the client that were kind of impacted for bizarre reasons. So suddenly you realize it's more tricky than it seems. So what is happening for typical POC initiative when you face all those problems? Well, you're going to kind of try to find ways to simplify the problems, and you will invariably circle back to let's do a classic forecasting proof of concept. So basically you will one way or another circle back to, oh, let's do weekly time series forecast. And why? Because it's when you think in terms of forecasting the demand based on historical demand, you would say, well, at least we can backtest that immediately, so we don't have those lead times, that introduce a delay. We can backtest right away, and then we can start to say, oh, as a first approximation, we will ignore stock outs, we will ignore promotions, we will ignore all the bizarre effects, and the end result is that you end up with something that does fit the definition of a proof of concept, which is basically something like a very simple time series forecast. But by doing that, you've completely, I would say, denatured the very problem you were trying to solve.
Let's talk a bit about backtesting. So that's basically looking at historical data that's very much in the past and making forecasts on that, where you should actually have the results and you can sort of compare the two. Why does backtesting not really work?
So again, backtesting does work from a statistical perspective. It has it has limits as well. What I'm saying is that from a supply chain perspective, backtesting is like a tiny numerical tool that is only, a fraction of the whole picture. For example, if you start thinking of optimizing, the purchasing patterns of your teams, it turned out that maybe all those MOQs are not, carved in stone. So maybe those infrequent purchases are just caused by the fact that your purchasing team has negotiated prices that are very low, yes, but that comes with exceedingly high MOQs, which force your teams to, I would say, put a lot of extra delay in between two purchase orders, which complicates everything and just inflates the lead times. So what I'm saying, outlining that, is that performing an optimization is not like a one-dimensional thing, such as decreasing error from a forecasting accuracy perspective. It's also embrace and revisit all the existing process and adjust what is being done when it's possible, so that optimization becomes actually possible. Plus, again, you need to think of what are you actually measuring, because the problem is that if you start, also invariably those tiny proof of concepts who invariably circles back to like time series accuracy benchmarks, also end up having an error expressed as a percentage instead of having like dollars of error. So that's, again, we're getting, I would say, again and again, we are very far from any fundamentals from the business.
Okay, so the real problem with forecasting is you're just focusing on that aspect and you're not looking at the bigger picture.
Plus, it's a very specific type of forecasting, because gathering all the relevant data is difficult, you can be assured that your POC, your proof of concept, is going to be a classic time series forecast with, weekly data in, weekly forecast out, and this is supposed to be it, and it isn't.
I guess what we're kind of describing today has come from a bit of pain of experience, so things that you've tried in the past and POCs you've done in the past. So what are some of the sort of key problems that you've experienced when you've done POCs?
I mean, the worst part is that sometimes you can, completely succeed the POC, and that was probably the things that did hurt the most. We're not losing a POC. I mean, as an enterprise software company, you don't win every single lead that comes your way. So it's only a low percentage. So losing leads is just a matter of life. What really hurts is you win the POC, because yes, in the POC you perform best, potentially by a huge margin. And then when you try to translate that into a production situation, the thing completely blow up and do not meet at all any of the expectation of the client. And then you realize, and why is that? Well, just because you moved from, I would say, a toy problem from a real world problem. And maybe whatever you had done for the toy problem was working very nicely on this toy problem, so which was typically involving, a very limited scope, a very well-defined metric, which was highly satisfying because it was very, very well defined, but maybe completely, I would say, ignoring all the business fundamentals and whatnot. And then when you transition toward the production situation, you just realize that your recipe is not even close at bringing an answer. And what is happening is that the worst part is that because supply chains have been digitalized for a couple of decades now for large companies, you realize that the solution you're bringing into the company is just going to be just like the previous atoms, and so it will produce walls of numbers, but that are going to be completely ignored by everybody, who are invariably where all the supply chain teams are invariably falling back to their usual Excel sheet, completely ignoring the dysfunctional numbers produced by yet another system.
Let's look at things now from the perspective of a company. The nice thing about a POC is you can sort of see the different way that different software vendors approach a problem, and you can see how they're actually reacting to certain challenges. Other than that, what are the alternatives that they can use instead of actually using a POC? What else could they do to see how different companies kind of perform?
So it's to focus, I would say, on the fundamentals. So I was pointing out the data. There is the challenge of consolidating all the data. The modern way of doing that at present date is basically to build a data lake. And the step beyond that is to provide some meaningful documentation from, I would say, a supply chain perspective. So that's, again, I'm focusing, to be capitalistic, you need to focus on what do not change. So your supply chain will probably not change in its most fundamental ways, such as you will still have suppliers, you will still have production units, you will still have warehouses, you will still have distribution channels. So there is plenty of things that are promised to be relatively stable. So to focus on that, and to have, when you consolidate all the data, to also consolidate the relevant documentation, because the big challenge with data is always the semantic of data. What does this date mean? When we have an order date, was it the date when you produced the order to be sent to the supplier? Was it the date when the entry was registered in your system? Was it the date when your supplier did acknowledge receiving the order, or whatever? Yeah, there is like a dozen possibilities. The question is, where is all those things documented? Again, if you do not have access to the data and semantic of the data, there is like no hope of ever optimizing anything. And again, for example, when I describe quantitative supply chain approach, yes, there is Lokad as a cloud computing platform to just execute at scale all those numerical recipes. But the things that are highly, highly capitalistic for the client is consolidation of all the data that are relevant, understanding the semantic of the supply chain, crafting metrics that truly reflect, the long-term financial interest of your company, which is difficult, crafting the processes that that play well with the physical constraints of your supply chain, and all of that are insights that are kind of largely independent from the toolkit that you use to execute those numerical calculations.
Okay, if we start sort of bringing things together and concluding today, POCs have been around in the supply chain industry for decades now. I mean, can you really envisage a time when POCs don't exist at all?
I mean, obviously, there will still be, young people who don't know any better who will ask for one more POC. That's just a fact of life. And maybe they will be right because, again, there are situations, even in supply chain, where a POC, proof of concept, is really the way to go. If you have like a new barcode printer that seems to be compatible with the system with the old barcode printers, but the new one is just better, faster, cheaper, leaner, and whatnot. This is a problem where you can buy one more barcode printer and test it out in your favorite warehouse. So there are situations where and problems where a proof of concept is just the way to go. Yet, when you want to think of, I would say, supply chain-wide optimization, a challenge that is really taking a holistic perspective on your supply chain, I would say don't expect too much from, I would say, small-scale experiments. It's just that invariably you will realize that the problem is complex, and if you do not, try hard enough, you will just fail because you've not even tried hard enough at the problem.
Okay, so as a final sort of key message from today, is the final key message that POCs can give you some sort of insight, but they don't expect too much. They don't really work as a whole.
Yes, and the opposite of a POC should not be a 10 years commitment with a vendor. I mean, that's also another thing, is that it's not because you're not doing a POC. You can say, for example, you can work with a vendor and say, what we would like is to start initiatives, a lean initiative, so it doesn't have to be very expensive. And then we will just move forward with you week after week, and instead of paying attention to the fact that, we are supposed to frame initiatives within, let's say, 10 weeks, it's more like, does the speed of progress of the initiative, is the momentum of this initiative satisfying? Is from a week to the next, are you making progress at a satisfying rate? And if you pick a vendor and after 3 weeks you realize that things seem still appear to be very sluggish, then you should quit. You see, but even in a time frame that is even shorter than a typical POC, the question is more like, you think 10 years ahead, but that's your vision. You focus on elements that will be super highly capitalistic for your company for the next decade. But when it comes to kick, an enterprise vendor out of the door because they're just not delivering, it's more on a weekly. It's more like a weekly assessment where you just revisit: are things progressing? Is there some kind of momentum building up? And you're looking at for all those small signs, and with, I would say, an indefinite planning in mind. I mean, again, it's and I would suggest to go for vendors that provide an option of no commitment or little commitment.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there, but we'll have to see if we've scared everyone off and no one will approach us to do a POC now. So that's everything for this week. Thanks very much for tuning in, and we'll see you again next time. Thanks for now.